Hello and welcome to another episode of Oops, We Broke the Multiverse. Today with us, we have Dre Deutschlaender interviewing him about his new revised version of Lotus Dimension. Thank you for joining us here, Dre. We got quite a few questions for you, so this should be good to go.
No problem. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here. Shawn, you want to take it away? Ask a few questions.
Sure. Well, let's start out with, okay, what is Lotus Dimension?
Sure. So Lotus Dimension is a tabletop role-playing game, the focus of which is solving challenges and encounters through nonviolence and pacifistic means. So rather than running at everything and hacking and slashing like D&D or some of the more stereotypical RPGs do, it was founded in trying to work around that same kind of encounter strategy, only without resorting to violence. That doesn't mean that players cannot choose those options, but then they are impacted negatively per se by the way the game mechanics work. So that's it in a nutshell.
Right on.
Doctor Who.
Am I on mute again?
Yeah,
God damn it.
we have to. There's echo. Go ahead.
It's very Doctor Whovian how it all works. Like you just try to find the most like non-violent method possible to get around and solve like certain aspects too. And I picked that up when I was reading the book too. And I was like, oh, I see how they can do this. Like just going about things in a certain way that doesn't necessarily like choose violence. They could if they wanted to, but there'd be no benefit for anyone involved if there was. I did appreciate that. What would make like players want to choose your game over something like Dungeons and Dragons? Like,
So I think one thing we offer is the kind of community strategy aspect. So in D&D, for example, you're very much character oriented. What can my character do when combat breaks out or when a situation breaks out? It's everyone kind of breaks into their own character role and what their skill set is. Lotus Dimension has the same thing, but then focuses more on the group as a whole. So for example, the way encounters work, it's not based on like a combat round or anything. It's really just here is the adversity you're up against, and with the tool sets your characters have, how are you going to bypass this in whatever way that you guys can think of, trying to focus on a way that's nonviolent and perhaps more empathic.
So, and I know you're not the creator, but can you give us kind of the rundown of how Scott came up with the game? And his video on Kickstarter was very good about that. He wanted to make a game that sort of highlights the methods through our own history that people have taken to, opt out of violence, but still achieve great things, which I think is really good. And everybody should check that out. But from your seat, Dre, how did that all come about? And then how did this revised edition come about? What's different? What's changed?
So I can't speak to the original inception of Scott's Kickstarter. The game got kickstarted in late summer of 2016. I was an original backer, me being a big game nerd, and I just like picking up games, and I was really taken by the setting. So I like kind of that neo cyberpunk type aesthetic to it, as well as the impulse of, hey, this is a nonviolent strategy. It's something different. My wife was actually the one who found the Kickstarter and said, hey, Dre, have you checked this out? And my wife, not being a big gamer, was just like, no, you should totally buy it and let it sit on the shelf for a few years, which is what it did. I came around because I'm a writer and an artist in general. So Scott had a Twitter post last year, probably in February or March, that said he was looking to combine all the original Kickstarter elements, which was the player handbook, the guru guide, which is kind of like your DM guide, and then a couple of quests into one cohesive document. Me being a sad tabletop RPG nerd, I had already started playing around with the game universe. So if you see the original Kickstarter documents, they're very bare bones. He kind of kickstarted, it blew up, it was very successful. But I don't know how he intended to go with the future longevity of the game. I was starting to take elements from it and make my own campaign kind of world, which is what I really like, is kind of that sandbox element, which is what I started bringing to it. I started making my own design encounters and challenge compendium, which is kind of like the version of a monster manual, which I don't think he was ever prepared for. So I said, hey, look what I've done. I'd love to help you out. And he was like, sweet. Could you help me with the layout and kind of redesign of all the text? So that was the original pitch. And so he brought me on just to kind of start taking all the stuff and combining it. Along the way, we started talking about the game aesthetic and rules development. So then I started asking about kind of the background of why mechanics work the way they are and how to better clarify that. So if you look at the difference between the revised edition book, which you guys have, and then the original Kickstarter, there's a lot more explanation of what things are and kind of elements, really down to the nuts and bolts, because what I wanted to do was give players and guru guides the kind of core stuff so that they could actually take the world and play with it. As it was in the Kickstarter, it was more kind of a standalone adventure game module. So here's your characters, here's some quests to play through, but there wasn't really a lot of meat to keep going with the game or expand the world to like some other campaign or narrative setting, unless you're a real big nerd like me, or perhaps you guys, where it's like you take just the little bits that you have and you start making all sorts of weird Lego shit out of it. And that's where I came along. So just starting to really focus and smooth over edges and really get into the game to make it more amenable and applicable to other game scenarios.
Love that. I think one of the things that interests us about playing all these different games is the different worlds we get to play in. Don't get us wrong, we love D&D, right? But like Blades in the Dark that we start with, that whole setting is so different, and we just couldn't wait to get our hands on it. So tell us about the world we're playing in Lotus Dimension. It sounds like a futuristic world.
Yep.
There's portals that pop up through the world, but what are the worlds at our disposal as a player? And then are there boundaries in those worlds based on gameplay? You know, can somebody write a campaign? It's like anything goes because we're hopping through a portal. That's almost a blank check, right? So tell us about the world we're in. Tell us about how players use them.
Sure. So Lotus Dimension takes place primarily on Earth in the year 2088. So not too far from where we are. It is as I said earlier, cyberpunk-like setting. The world exists kind of at the behest of some mega corporations that kind of run everything. In the background of all these mega corporations is actually a mystical group of dark bodhisattvas. So in Buddhist mythology and Hindu mythology, the bodhisattvas are people who have become enlightened to the point of Buddha, but they've chosen to stay behind in order to better mankind. The dark bodhisattvas have kind of sinister and ulterior motives for what they do in terms of how they see them steering the world. The player characters take on the role of nobles, which are kind of a underground pacifistic movement that are aware that the corporations and the dark bodhisattvas are not all it appears to be, and kind of work to prevent that. So throughout the course of the quests, as Scott wrote them, you're basically finding portals into different realms. There are 8 realms, and each one is kind of tied to a element of the Eightfold Path of Buddhism. So rightful mind, rightful view, rightful action, etc. And then there are bodhisattvas in each realm, which are helping explain the mission to the players and give them tools and assets as well.
So that's cool. So those 8 worlds, so these are actually those portals. It's limited to the 8, and each one's going to have its own rules or you know, kind of aesthetic. Yeah. Yep. Thank you. So you're facing a big challenge. I think as I read this and chime in, you guys, I'm like, okay, you're facing a big challenge here because D&D players, I know some D&D players, they're just like, when do we fight? I can't wait to fight. You know, like you've made a game that doesn't have that mechanic, right? but you had to have made it interesting on how you combat. You still combat. You're
Yep.
just not fighting through violence.
Yep. So yeah, it's an interesting way in terms of Scott's original mechanics. So the way the mechanics work is each encounter tests one of the 8 abilities that the characters have. So the characters then kind of come together, look at their tools in terms of items. Eventually, they have magic spells and they have kind of extra sensory abilities that are kind of extraordinary. And then they use those and say, okay, if we do this and do this, this is how we'll get around this challenge. And then they roll their abilities against that challenge rating. There's some funky math, but that's really it. As from my perspective as a writer, I'm really much interested in kind of the character aspects. So what does it take to have a character meet a force and kind of break down or overcome that? What is it that challenges them in terms of their flaws or their abilities? So very much grew up in that vein. So the original campaign quests that Scott designed have very kind of linear structure. I've been working to make that much more open-ended as well. So
and like one of the things that I loved about reading this was the simplified version of the character sheets, whereas in like Dungeons and Dragons you get like 3 or 4 pages devoted to one character. On this is very simplified. You had your eight little things at the very top that you can use for your different aspects or what things you need to overcome the encounter that you're on, and then the rest of it was based on like just very role playing wise. It's
right.
very devoted to role playing instead of on Dungeons and Dragons you have like 8 sheets for like their armor class or whatever. It's very, let's get in there, let's tell a story, let's act through it. And that's one of the things. And I guess I wrote this as a statement and not a question. So
yep, it's very clean. So one thing, especially as I've gotten older, so some background on me, my first RPG experience outside of video games was with the original AD&D. I grew up and kind of sharpened my teeth on an old system called Rollmaster by Iron Crown Enterprises, which has the notorious nickname of also being called Chartmaster. So every weapon, everything had its own different chart that you would roll against with explanations filled out. I've had experience with Call of Cthulhu, Star Wars when it was in Wizards of the Coast's hands before Fantasy Flight picked it up, and a whole bunch of other stuff. One thing that really kind of impressed me, eventually somebody gifted me with a book from the late 80s, I think, called Talislanta. That was a kind of fantasy setting, but one thing that interested me was the character skill sets were kind of like if you were playing this type of character, these like 3 things were your skill sets. It was very AD&D like, or old school essentials, which is kind of that renaissance coming around now. So kind of how to make things a little less wordy and much more simplistic. So that's one thing I liked. I know Scott, the game designer, once asked me about money and stuff like that because we talked about inventory and management, which becomes key in terms of what your characters have and what they can do with it to overcome stuff. I wasn't a fan of keeping track of money or credits or any of that, so I created a system called the River of Karma, which is essentially if a player is looking to obtain something, they basically roll against that, and then if they're successful, they can basically say, yep, I obtained it because I have these kind of contacts, or someone has noticed me and gifted me with such and such. So something to keep it much more simple than a whole bunch of bookkeeping, which, albeit fun if you're playing like an AD&D wizard, and sometimes I really like that, can also be a little grindy when you look at a character sheet and there's 8,000 different blanks to fill out. That makes it somewhat imposing. I know Scott's original intent was to make a game that was very accessible for all ages. And I think he's done a pretty good job of making a game that is kind of interesting, has its own unique mechanics, and can be accessible from early on.
Absolutely. Why don't you walk us through the different character types?
Sure. So there are 8 character types. Each character class is associated with one of the eightfold attributes. So in Buddhism, those attributes are essentially the path to enlightenment of being able to maximize one's rightful acclamation into those. So the first class is the wanderer. He's aligned with view. So the wanderer is someone who's kind of a vagabond or vagrant. They understand people. So as he's exposed to the world, he sees that there are many different viewpoints to come at things and from situations. The next character class is the hacker. The hacker is associated with intention, and they sorry, I'm gonna pull out my rule book and cheat here.
Oh, that's what I'm doing too.
There we go. All right. So, and their goal is it's kind of your all the overall the text. So I would say it's kind of applicable to like a rogue type, but that's not always the case. You think hackers as white hats or scoundrels, and that's not always true. They can be very noble in intention as well. The journalist, so they're associated with speech. So they're going to be kind of your negotiator type character. So if you're looking for a challenge or you're trying to do something that is word oriented, that's where the journalist comes into play. They're focused on the ability to give others inspiration as well. The free runner or a parkour practitioner, they're associated with action. So that's kind of your ability to move. Again, it's a very oblique stat. So just action is not necessarily just doing things, but it's also a intent of branching out and acting out, so to speak. So a low action score, for example, would be someone who's maybe they're considerate and they take their time before they work on something. So a low score isn't necessarily negative. It's more a reflection of certain character traits, perhaps on a sliding scale. You have the artist, and that includes all sorts of quote unquote art practitioners. So painters, sculptors, etc. They're aligned with livelihood. So that's the ability to live in the world and act in a way that does not have a negative footprint. So the artist in this sense is someone who's kind of folksy or down to earth in a way that they understand that they're not commercial. So versus the corporate artist, etc. Doesn't mean you can't necessarily be in that sphere, but they understand kind of where they're coming from versus the ends to the needs. The illusionist, or perhaps a street magician, aligned with energy. So they are sleight of hand practitioners or kind of mental mindset practitioners. That's someone who's going to be very street smart, very witty, etc. They also gain an ability to do more in terms of the magic system that the game later on takes into role. The shaman is a character who is kind of your cleric archetype. So they commune with spirits, they work overall with the world unseen, and then they are also more active in being the party healer, so to speak. So they have abilities that help free up life points for individuals and heal damage, etc., that comes in from failing challenges. And then the monk, they're aligned with concentration. That's kind of the overall aspect of being able to be present in the moment. They're able to do things that are kind of ESP generated. So they're mind over matter. They do some telekinesis stuff if you choose that kind of skill set. And then kind of represent the best in terms of being able to sacrifice themselves for the greater good of the world. So those are the 8 character types.
Awesome. And I'm assuming you're going to level up these characters. So there's probably pre-built kind of level up different skills, things they could pick up. They could get better at what they do, hone those skills.
Correct. The way the experience, quote unquote, point system works is your characters lose karma as they adventure through the world and as they do good. So if they have actions that help others and do not negatively impact the world around them, they actually lose karma. And as they drop karma, that's when they start gaining new skill sets based on their character class type. They gain access to extra inventory items. They gain access to next level items. So for example, the Wanderer gets a bulletproof vest. The hacker gets a burner cell phone that can basically text any message to like any device. And then they gain access to some mystical abilities as well.
So walk us through a conflict.
Sure.
Okay. You've played this game, I imagine.
Yep.
So let's say, I mean, is there a situation where like, hey, this, the bad guy is going to throw some thugs at you, but we're nonviolent, right? So I really want to drive that point home. That's that's such a great premise. But say that, I mean, people, that doesn't mean others around you or in this world aren't going to use violence, right? As a matter of fact, they're probably going to pick on you for that reason, right? They're going to come at you to do that. How does a party who is, who is enlightened enough to not use violence against it, how do they, a group of thugs is coming to attack you? That's an immediate threat physically. How does the group deal with that? Give us an example.
Sure. So let's say, just take your example of the group of thugs. There's many ways out of conflict, not necessarily just bull rushing head on. For example, the journalist who is speech oriented, they might start by attempting to talk them down, or even bribe the thugs, or try to explain like, hey, I know you're working for this guy, but did you know XYZ, and he's actually not looking out for your best interests. So exposing those human threats that are coming at you to a different way of thinking is just one way around the conflict. You could, for example, if I'm a free runner, parkour, then it's just a matter of, well, I'm gonna, use my free running skills, run up the wall and get up to higher ground and then avoid them altogether. You could knock them unconscious, so use a spell that might put them to sleep, or do something else. Again, you could even say, well, we're gonna tie them up and then leave them there, and might be something towards a path of violence, but knowing where you want to stop. And you might even have a character that's like, no, I'm gonna rush them head on and be done with it, and maybe bop them in the face, which is not the goal you want to do, but it's certainly an option. So there's lots of different ways to think about the encounter. A lot of it relies on the guru guide and the players being open to that and flexible, as well as being very creative in terms of understanding kind of the narrative world around you. What's at your disposal? What skill sets do you have? Kind of environment oriented, kind of like a good D&D battle, right? There's all sorts of stuff going on that, your players could hack at everything, but there's different things that they could do. Even if you put this little crane over here, that if they push buttons or pull ropes and then they don't, and they just go and use mighty swing or whatever. So
yeah, I think it is interesting to see how that unfolds, right? And it really puts players out of their comfort zone. It's so easy to be like, yep, I just pull my arrows, I kill them, boom, I'm great at this. Like they really have to role play into what's around me, what is really going to help me get through this, right? And solve the problem or the immediate threat.
Yeah.
So and I compare this to D&D a lot, because that's what most of the tabletop RPG players are used to, right? And Scott did this in his video too, because that's the universal language. So in D&D, when you're trying to get a mission or whatever, you're like, let's go to the local tavern and let's talk and see what we hear. And, and then all of a sudden you've got a quest, right? How does that happen for you in Lotus Dimension?
So the original quests as Scott wrote them are very kind of story driven. I don't want to use the word linear because I'm trying to pull it away from that, but the originals were railroady to a degree of what was beyond in terms of the open world. That's kind of where I have tried to flex some of my creative muscles and help for the revised edition is giving more tools and groundwork. The nobles are kind of a underground group of freedom fighters. So there's lots of opportunities for the player characters to be involved with that one way or another. One thing one of my players had mentioned not too long ago in the game while we were playing was there didn't seem to be a lot of impetus for kind of grassroots nonviolent movements and organizations. So because the way the current adventures that we've been playing through are structured, it's kind of encounter to encounter, etc., and not a lot of world design in terms of letting them breathe and kind of what characters might do in their downtime. I'm going to set up a tavern and run it, or I'm going to do this with my bard and do a theater troupe on the side that doesn't have a lot of role playing, but is intrinsic to the way the character functions within the narrative world. So I'm working on expanding that. That's, I think, something that's going to be part of the challenge compendium or monster manual as we play around with that as we move forward. What else could the game be? I think there's a lot opportunity for growth. I don't necessarily think Scott was prepared for that when I kind of came out of the woodwork and said, hey, I'm still playing this game, or I'm interested. So I think there's excitement around that in terms of really giving it some legs and push to be not just something different, but also something competitive with the current D&D / really combat or dice focused games. So there's a lot of necessary non-violent or story-driven games that are out there. They're just so niche that I think it takes some sifting through the pile. So
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us about the Guru Guide. Am I saying that right? That's kind of
Yep.
your dungeon master
Correct.
in this game.
Yep. So the Guru Guide is the one who is basically functions as the game master. He has kind of the overall idea of the story. He's got all the notes and stuff hidden behind his screen, as well as sets up all the various challenges. One thing I've put a lot of work into in the revised edition is helping Scott explain where the numbers and the stats kind of come into play. A lot of that in the original game design was just kind of matter of fact, and there wasn't a lot of explanation of how to take it from step A to step B. So if you wanted to make your own challenge, it was kind of a tease to really dig at the information. And, I have years of game experience where I was like starting to pull out the nuts and bolts of what was driving kind of how challenges are created. And I've tried to help explain that for Guru Guides. The Guru Guide also facilitates some non-combat elements for players. So the original quests have designed to have some reflection and meditative moments for the players, sometimes at the disgruntlement of the players. I always say take that with as much salt as you want it and incorporate as much of that as you want in the game. So for example, what I mean by that is at the end of the first quest, there's a meditative labyrinth that the players kind of walk, and their goal is to really reflect on, okay, I just played this game and my character just made it through things, and then talk about their experience. There's a element in quest 2 while you're in one of the Lotus Dimension called the Petal Realms, one of those realms, and it's kind of a open canvas, and the way to navigate this is through actually drawing out a mandala or a meditative kind of circle, and then describing that and using it as a way of moving your character through their desires and their fears in this world that could create either of those out of nothing. So some interactive elements. If the players aren't prepared, it might be a little off-putting. So again, it's one of those things is a group should always talk among themselves, know what they're getting into. Because if you just whip this out at the table and say, hey guys, we're going to play Lotus Dimension, and your regular group is not necessarily in that vein, they might not have fun with that. And it's always about communicating that and what the goal is too. I think there's a lot to be gained from how the game operates, even if you only play a couple sessions, and then take it back. So
Very cool. Yeah. Good explanation. Does kind of like in Blades in the Dark, which is what we're playing right now, there is no map, there's no minis, none of that stuff. There's dice, and in their game, you're using basically a 6-sided die, many of them.
Yep.
What are the, I suppose, accessories, maps, minis, dice that come with or that you would need to play the game?
Yep. So Lotus Dimension runs on basically 6 8-sided dice. 3 are white colored or light colored, and 3 are black or dark colored. So whichever works. I don't have all white and I don't have all black. Mine are all a mix. So basically, the players' stats are affecting the white or the light colored dice, and the challenge or the adversity that they're up against affect the black colored, and then you compare those two numbers. And then there is a coin you flip. It's called the Karma coin. If you order the game or the starter set through Scott or 39 Forks Publishing, which is his company, you get this nice little black and white plastic coin, but any coin works. And the way that affects the game is it creates what's called a karma ripple. So anytime you attempt a challenge, you're rolling the 6 dice, so white and black. Your stats get added to the white, the challenge's stats get added to the black, you compare them, and then you flip this coin, which either lands light side up or dark side up. If the coin is light side up, regardless of the outcome of the challenge, success or failure, it creates a positive karma ripple. So that might be something good happens to the players or something good happens in the world overall. And if it lands dark side up, then something negative happens either to the players or overall. So they might find items, or they might lose items, or they might inspire someone down the road, or they might make an enemy of someone down the road. It's very open to interpretation. The encounters in the challenges in the narrative are used as a guideline, and I think they offer good examples, but I'm really kind of excited to see how players might take that with their own experiences and world and push those forward. So
excellent. There was quite a big following on the Kickstarter. I mean, so this is 2016. He hit his goal. He made the game, right?
Yep.
How has it progressed since then? How's the fan base? How are people enjoying it? Give us some of that feedback. How did it land in the real world?
So short answer is I don't necessarily know. I don't see a lot of traction from the game now. And I've kind of, I'm on Twitter, and I've kind of put some feelers out there. I was not active in the community on Kickstarter in terms of really pushing for the game. I came about after the fact and said, oh, but I'm still here and I'm still liking this game. And I think Scott was excited to see that there was still a fan out there. And I think there are still fans out there. I think we're just kind of few and far between. He mentioned that people were sending him pictures of them playing the game in cosplay gear. So there was a lot of initiate group excitement. I think one of the reasons the game's kind of gone quiet is because the initial 4 quests were so linear, and it didn't offer a lot of impetus to go beyond that. It's kind of we played through these quests and now we're done. We played Ravenloft, we beat Strahd, and now we're done. So that's one of my goals being on board on the project now, is to really reignite that community, and hopefully have people kind of come out of the woodwork saying, yeah, I did kickstart this, I'm really still interested in this, as well as giving them tools to keep playing the game and work the game on their own, beyond what the original Kickstarter was. So, which I think just kind of took them for a surprise when the Kickstarter really kind of blew up the way it did. It's exciting to see that there's still some longevity in there. So
yeah. I mean, that's a lot of followers. That's a lot of support. And now, where would we go to buy the game? So if people hear this and like, cool, I want to play, how do I get it? How do people go and get the game?
So you can reach out on lotusdimension.com or go to 39 Forks Publishing. That's 39 Forks Publishing, and purchase the game, the original starter set. So that's going to be, I think, the original Kickstarter set, which would be the player guide, the guru guide, and then the kind of the first two quests, or first quest in paper format, along with some. It comes with dice and the karma coin, as I mentioned. We're working on getting everything together into the big bound book. That the goal for that is to be by end of summer. Kind of had that in place. So what you guys saw, that's about 75% complete.
Holy
Really to
cow.
make that the driving force. So
That's great. Well, it's very complete. I mean, there's a lot to it. You sent that to me. I was like, oh wow, these guys have thought of everything, right?
yeah, if you,
and
you compare
more.
the two, it's exciting to see the changes. I'm really proud to be a part of that. Scott has a really great mind, and he's also given me a lot of carte blanche to explain where I'm coming from. I think we hit it off in terms of similar design aesthetics. I always wanted to be true to his original vision of the game. I believe in what the game stands for in terms of being something different and really thinking differently. I'm not a Buddhist practitioner, but I've got some martial arts experience and some kind of ideology in that frame of making the world a better place, and really how to use that into a game design, usually where you're, well, I want to huck dice and fight a bunch of stuff. Well, here's a chance to huck dice and fight a bunch of stuff, but without actually fighting. So,
which could be more satisfying, right?
yep.
All right. Any other questions for Dre?
There it is. Found the mute button.
Ah,
So when I was reading the manual that you sent us, I saw a chunk in there, like a little statement saying that you guys were still working on like high player level content.
Yep.
Any chance we can get a sneak peek at that?
so we haven't gotten that far in design. I think that's an original statement Scott wrote when he created the game, in terms of eventually, as the player's stats max out, they become bodhisattvas in their own right, which would then essentially be your version of a high level D&D character campaign. Everyone's at 20th level and can do these godlike things. I've pushed them for some more information on the petal realms, so we can kind of start exploring that. The initial information in the original materials was kind of bare bones, especially for the petal realms and the Lotus Dimension that the characters explore. So I'm really pushing to kind of create an atlas of that. The essential abilities of the bodhisattvas are almost world breaking, to the point where they wouldn't necessarily operate on Earth the same way. So it would be a much more kind of cosmic planescape hopping experience. I don't think we've quite thought what that looks like yet. So
Good question. How about you?
He answered one of my questions and one of your questions, and then you stole one of mine, so I'm good.
excellent.
All right. Do you have a quick elevator speech sort of? Give us an example of a campaign you had with your party, with friends you played with, and give us that quick overview so we get an idea of what was it like to play that game, right? We haven't played obviously yet,
Sure.
but give us a quick kind of like, here's what we did, here's the players that were involved, here's what we achieved.
So my current group consists of my wife and two buddies who are very on board with the idea. They've graciously also been playtesting some of these mechanics that we've worked into this revised edition. So I guinea pigged them, and they were happy to do so, I think. So for example, the start of the very first quest that's in the book, the players are kidnapped by this group called the Black Lotus, which is led by the Dark Bodhisattvas. They're taken on board a ship, and then they're going to be with this group of people, and they're going to be slave labor at a corporate camp.
Is that is that quest number one, liberation in the Zeppelins?
Correct.
Okay, and you mentioned Dark Lotus, like there's like Jedi and Sith going on here.
Yes.
It feels like.
Yep.
Okay, so as good as you can build yourself, you can also build a dark character, it sounds
Right.
like. Oh,
Yep.
wow. Okay.
Yep. And the dark bodhisattvas and the light bodhisattvas are actually two sides of the same character. There's some story elements there in terms of what happened and why there's a split, and then kind of a fracturing of the petal realms and Earth. And Scott's kind of cards close to the chest, and I'm more like, well, We need some more meat if we're gonna drag people on board. You can't just put it in the quest. I want to world build and I want to play around in the cities and kind of go off the rails. And my players probably will too, as most players do. So what does that look like? So anyways, in that first quest, the characters are in the shipping container. You need to escape. So your first challenge is, how do you escape the shipping container? It's got a rusty lock. You can if you speak out, you can hear voices around you and the others and talk to other prisoners. They'll kind of give you information on what's going on. There's a group of guards that patrol the deck of the ship. They're armed with rifles, for example. So the first immediate thought in one of my players' mind was like, oh, I don't want to mess with those guys. They have guns. And we talked about that. So they escape from the ship. Their next task is to explore the ship. So that's basically dumbed it down into a challenge rating of exploring the ship. One of my characters is a wanderer, one of them is a hacker, and one of them is a shaman. So the Shaman decided that he would explore the ship by kind of reaching out to the spirit world and then seeing what's out there. So what that required was for him to stay meditating in one spot. He failed that role, and so that meant that the guard was coming around and was going to be aware of them. So what they did then was hide back in the shipping container. And so that required a kind of off the cuff challenge rating of whether the guard notices them and what that means. They were successful in that challenge against the guard's perception, so to speak, but they failed the dark karma coin toss. So what that resulted in was, so the guard doesn't see him, but he's suspicious. He gets on his radio and he wakes up all these other guys in the dead of night and says, hey, something's going on. You guys should wake up. So what that did was elevate now the challenges for the rest of the game, which was not spelled out in the book, but I basically had to off the cuff guru guide and basically up the challenges by another 1 or 2 points. So then they explored the ship through another means. They used the hackers to find a terminal and download a layout of the ship and get
Straight
around
up
the ship that way.
R2D2.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. See,
different approaches.
You think about that and you're like, oh, he's not going to have a computer. How's he going to do anything? It's like, oh no, dude, they have tech. You just use theirs. And this guy knows his way around it. That's pretty cool.
Yep. So it's very, the skills are nebulous to the degree of, how do they operate within the world, giving you a lot of freedom, a lot of creativity, but also trying to be grounded in a way that they're not OP and breaking everything. So there's a lot of the next level items or character abilities that I helped kind of cement down. The original text just had a laundry list of this is what the Wanderer has without really explaining what they do. So the hacker gets a USB key drive that's like a skeleton key for any computer. It doesn't really say what it does. So needed some flesh and blood and bones, and that's where I've been involved in the project. So
thanks for adding some kind of real play context to the game. So now we can kind of see, well, if it was D&D, oh, I just use my short axe and I break that lock and I come out and I start swinging. Like, this is far more challenging and honestly kind of more real, right? If you found yourself in a container, I don't have a freaking, we haven't cussed yet. I don't have a fucking bow and arrow. That is so out of character for us.
So appropriate this episode.
Yeah. That's your one F-bomb for this PG-13 rating.
Yeah.
Well, so because I think the original way my players got out of the shipping container was the Wanderer. They can start with a multi-tool. They use that to pry up the hinges on the door, for example, and do that, right? Very simple kind of, this is what I have, and this. So the Wanderer attempts the first challenge, rolling against it. So
excellent. Well, so we really appreciate Scott. Make sure he knows. I hope he listens to this. Let him know we're super grateful that he wanted to be a part of this. And thank you, Dre. We appreciate your time and being a part of this. But anything else you'd like to share with the listeners about the game, or anything to that effect?
So if anyone's listening who did originally kickstart the game who's still interested, you can reach me on Twitter. I'm at Kamirat. I'll share those details with you guys. You can also reach out on Lotus Dimension and email. We're looking to kind of get the band back together. So if you were a player and it's kind of something you let sit on the shelf, we'd love to hear from you, because I'm really interested in people who did play the game and were part of the community, and reigniting that. I'm kind of getting a Discord together just so people can throw shit back online. I've got some files on my personal website, just examples of characters and some other challenges that I wrote, just to be like, hey, there's an ability to play with more than what was in the original set. I spent a lot of energy to kind of reignite that in myself and really do it, even though nobody was listening at the time. And now I have a whole audience of people. So thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again. This has been really interesting, and it's our first interview on the podcast. So you'll always be our first. You always have a special place. So yeah, do let us know if you'd love to walk us through a campaign one of these days, and we could record that too. And all about trying to support you guys and what you're doing.
Yeah. I really like the feel of this channel too. So, I think you talked about the Coyote and Crow RPG. My wife is native, and I'm like, sweet, this sounds right up our jam. So yeah, I'm really excited to be a part of this. Thank you for interviewing me, letting me come on and give my spiel. Thanks for your open minds and open tables.
There we go. Thank you. Thank you for listening to Oops, We Broke the Multiverse podcast. We've been interviewing Dre Deutschlaender, and the game is Lotus Dimension, created by Scott Wayne, Indiana. You can check out more by going to lotusdimension.com. Thank you, Dre.